We're on Gimel and Aleph, toward the bottom of the page, and we're trying to figure out the Mishnah. The Mishnah basically said that there was a machlekes between Reb Meir and the Rabbanon, and as I'll explain the Mishnah now, I'll change it in a few minutes. Reb Meir says that kesef al yedei acherim, if the Eved Kanani is being redeemed, emancipated for money, it needs to be done via somebody else. And the way this was, and if it's done with a document, he must accept the document. And the rabbis say the opposite. Kesef aydei atzmai shtar aydei acherim. Kesef he must accept. Kesef he's able to give to redeem. Shtar, a document, we call it shichur, an emancipation. It must be accepted by somebody else. Now, so I'm not sure exactly where to start. We're over halfway down Chagim Aleph. I'm not sure. I'm just going to summarize outside, and then I'll decide where to pick it up. I'm not 100% sure yet. Okay, so this was how we laid out in the Mishnah. In the Gemara, we had a problem with the opinion of Reb Meir. The question was as follows. Reb Meir says that money works through somebody else. And the Gemara wants to know, is that with the knowledge of the slave or without the knowledge of the slave? If it's with the knowledge of the slave, 1 second. So the Gemara tries to say that it must be with his knowledge, because according to Reb Meir, what's going on here is an obligation for the slave. The slave doesn't want to be freed. So how can you accept redemption for a slave if he doesn't agree to it? So it must be that he agrees. But if he agrees, then why can't somebody else accept an emancipation on his behalf? A shtar, if he agrees. So the Gemara's conclusion is, no, we're talking about where he doesn't agree. And the idea here is, according to Reb Meir, that he doesn't know what's going on. Somebody else is redeeming him, maybe against his will even, but doesn't make a difference, because somebody else could buy him as a slave. Somebody is able to redeem him as a slave. Normally, we say, if I want, I can't purchase a traffic ticket on your behalf, right? It's not something you particularly want. That's sort of the typical framework. And in this case, if the same would apply to a slave. Slave doesn't want to be freed. Nobody can acquire his freedom on his behalf. But money is different, because money, you can sell the slave, so therefore you can redeem him even against his will. So that's what the Mishnah is talking about. Money works through somebody else. A document he must agree to. A document does not work against his will.
This is a Canaanite.
Yes. Okay, now, if this is the case that we're talking about, what the slave does not know, so let's get to the opinion of the rabbis. That's, I think, where we'll start. We will start with, which is the 2 dots, a little more than 2/3, around 2/3 of the way down of 23a. Okay. Second set of 2 dots. So first. Exactly.
Okay.
So Gemara says, money, he has to agree to it. Somebody else, money has to be done through him, not through somebody else. The Gemara says, while it is true that it must be, if Reb Meir is talking about a scenario where the Eved is not aware, it must be that rabbis are talking about the same scenario, because they're debating each other, right? If your opinion is that apples are good and my opinion is that oranges are good, it's not necessarily a debate. There's a debate here. Clearly, they're talking about the same context. So it must be that we're talking about shalai midaita, where the slave is not aware. The Gemara says, well, why can't the slave be redeemed by somebody else if he's not aware of it, or even if he doesn't want it? Mechti. Let's examine this. The rabbi's opinion is that a slave does want to be emancipated. This was a major debate we saw in I think it was the beginning of Kiddushin. I believe it was in gittin. Might have been in gittin as well. Basically, the question is, he probably wants to be emancipated, but does he want the sexual restrictions of emancipation? A slave has a lot less not a lot less. Effectively, he's free to be with any maidservant. Whereas a ben chayran is limited to getting married and the associated responsibilities. The slave is not responsible for his offspring. There's no child support. Okay, so that's sort of the debate. So the rabbis say it is a merit. If it's a merit, then why can't somebody else acquire the slave on his behalf? Presumably, it's like $1 million. The slave acquires his freedom. It's worth a lot of money. Presumably, he would want it. We learn so if you're picking up a lottery ticket for me, presumably you could do it in my name because I probably would want a lottery ticket, even if I'm not mathematically challenged and I don't buy lottery tickets. But if you want to give it to me for free, that's fine. And but an obligation, but an obligation he must agree to. Okay, so if that's the case, why can't somebody else acquire the slave on his behalf? Why does a slave specifically have to give the money for redemption? Why can't somebody else give the money? And if you'll say, what does it mean? He could redeem himself. It means both he and somebody else. And the chiddush here is the rabbi. This is really the main thrust of the rabbi's argument, which is that we'll talk about this basically most of the day today, which is, can a slave own something? According to Rabbi Meir, the answer is no. And there's a period at the end of that. It's 0. No.
Period or exclamation mark?
Both. 0. Cannot own anything. According to the rabbis, a slave could own something, except that whatever a slave owns, it goes to the master. So how do you have something that goes to the slave? You give it to him on condition that the master has no rights over it. And we'll discuss how it's possible for a slave to actually own something. We'll discuss it more in a couple minutes. Okay, so that's the main point of the rabbis, and that's why the rabbis are saying the slave himself could redeem. The slave could redeem himself. How could he redeem himself? Because he's able to acquire money. If that's the case, let's look at the end of the Mishnah. A document could be he can be emancipated with a document through somebody else, but not through himself. The Gemara says, what do you mean? We have learned that the get and the ability to acquire the get come at the same time. And therefore, why can't he redeem himself? And if you'll say, meaning he could be redeemed by himself and by somebody else, and the chiddush is and the reason why somebody else can acquire an emancipation on his behalf is because it is a merit, according to the rabbi's opinion. The slave does want to leave his bondage. Then if that's the case, effectively, that both kesef and shtar are both redeemable through the slave and through somebody else, and then we should just put it all together. It should say as follows: the kesef ubishtar, with money and with the document, bein aidei acherem, bein aidei atzmai, both through himself and somebody else. Are we together on the question? Mm-hmm. Okay, so now the Gemara is sort of making a radical departure here. And the Gemara is saying that the rabbi's opinion of the Mishnah is not really the rabbi's opinion. There's two parts to the rabbi's opinion. Okay, so just hold with me first before we continue. Just discuss it out. Summarize it, and then we'll see the Gemara. Basically, as follows. There's three opinions in the Mishnah. The first opinion is Rabbi Meir's opinion. Rabbi Meir's opinion we already saw. Rabbi Meir says that a slave does not want to leave. Why doesn't he want to leave? Because of sexual promiscuity. He'd rather be a slave than to be a free man. Therefore, it is not a merit. He doesn't want somebody to accept a divorce, an emancipation on his behalf. And if the emancipation is written down, it cannot be accepted on his behalf. However, money, he could be redeemed against his will. That's because he can be sold with money, he can be redeemed with money, even if the money is against his will. So somebody else can redeem him, even against his will. A document somebody else cannot accept on his behalf. He must accept the documents. The rabbis say, no, you're making a mistake here. Both money and documents work both with the slave and with somebody else. And the rabbi's opinion is a half a line in the Mishnah. It's bekesef ayidei atzmai, period. Money works through the slave himself. Meaning to say, according to the rabbi's opinion, money works also with the slave. Both the slave and the master both the slave and a stranger can redeem him with money. And the reason for that is the slave does have the ability to own something. So it is possible for the slave to redeem himself. Now, the third part of the Mishnah is nothing to do with the rabbi's opinion. It's actually a third opinion, which is the opinion of Rav Shimon ben Elazar. Shimon ben Elazar does not like the concept of gittin v'yadei ba'in ka'echad. Gittin v'yadei ba'in ka'echad means, we said this yesterday, it's the chicken and the egg problem, right? You're only emancipated, you only get the ability to acquire yourself if you're emancipated. But you're only emancipated if you have the ability to acquire the emancipation, right? So what came first, the chicken and the egg? And the answer is they both came together. The ba'in ka'echad, right? The ability to acquire the divorce, to acquire the emancipation, and the emancipation itself come at the same moment. That's the opinion of the rabbis. Rav Shimon also rejects that. If that's the case, if he rejects that concept, then what happens? Who can redeem a slave with the document? Only somebody else, acting as a messenger for the slave. The slave himself cannot acquire his own emancipation because he doesn't have the ability to acquire it. The chicken and egg conundrum. And we don't say gittin v'yadei ba'in ka'echad. We don't say they happen at the same time. So that's the three opinions. Put together? Mm-hmm. Okay. This commercial go pretty quickly. Okay. Money is if he's redeeming himself with money. One second. One second. One second here. Okay, that's the just skip the line. One second. Hold on. All right, there it is. Okay, so there's two separate things here. Bekesef, if it's done with money, and that's the opinion of the rabbis, right? And the rabbis also say, by the way, shtar also both. It's bekesef and shtar meaning whether he knows or not. Why whether he knows or not? Because the rabbis say that a slave does want to be emancipated. Okay. Bishtar, but with regard to a document, this is the opinion of Rav Shimon Elazar. Specifically through somebody else, but not through the slave himself. Rav Shimon Elazar, it's the opinion of Rav Shimon Elazar. The Tanya we learned Rav Shimon Elazar Omer, Af bishtar ayidei acherem. Af bishtar ayidei acherem v'lo ayidei atzmai. One second. The Tanya Rav Shimon Elazar Omer. Rav Shimon Elazar says, Af bishtar ayidei acherem v'lo ayidei atzmai. A document must be done. A slave being emancipated with a document must be emancipated through somebody else. Somebody else must acquire it on his behalf. But not through himself. He cannot emancipate himself. Why can't he emancipate himself? Because he doesn't have the ability to acquire the emancipation. If the master gives him an emancipation, he can't acquire it because we don't say gittin v'yadei ba'in ka'echad. There were three debates. That explanation of three debates is that long Rashi there on the side of the page, and that's what I explained to you before. 4 lines in the bottom of the page. Amar Rabba. My time of Rav Shimon Elazar. What's the reason of Rav Shimon Elazar that says we do not say gittin v'yadei ba'in ka'echad? Gomer lo lo meisha. Ma isha atshiyotzi get l'rishus she'ein shaloi. Evanami atshiyotzi get l'rishus she'ein shaloi. Okay, so unlike a master with a slave, a man with a woman, the man doesn't own the woman. You know, we talk about Kiddushin as sort of a kinyan, but he doesn't own her. Therefore, the divorce, when it gets to her hand, is actually a domain that isn't his. And what we learned from the array is that is the how do you say it? It's the same mechanics of it's not a good word. It's the same surah. It's the same outline of a get, meaning a divorce is given to put in a domain where the husband does not have control. So to an emancipation must be put into a domain where the master has no control, and that domain can't be the slave, because the slave, he does have control. He actually does own a slave. If somebody else receives it on his behalf, then it works. Boy, Rabba has the following question. The Reb Shimon ben Elazar, according to Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Evet Kanani, Mao Shiasa Shliach Lekabel Gittin Miyad Rabbi. 1 second. According to Reb Shimon, this is a fun question. Okay, so according to Reb Shimon ben Elazar, a slave cannot receive his own emancipation. Why not? Because he's owned by the master. Can he be a messenger to receive an emancipation for another slave? Do we say that just like a woman can be a can be a messenger to receive a slave on behalf of another woman, so to a slave should be able to be a messenger to receive an emancipation on behalf of another slave. A woman, she can receive her own divorce, therefore she can appoint a messenger. He should not be able to, since he can't receive his own emancipation, he shouldn't be able to make a messenger to receive it either. After he asked the question, he resolved it. Just like a woman, the slave can appoint another slave as a messenger. Asks the Gemara, hold on. Can appoint. What's the problem with this? The famous Talmudical passage, which we saw in Nidorim previously, which is, are the Kohanim that bring karbonos, do they serve as the messengers of God or the messengers of us? And the answer is, they're the messengers of God. Why? Because we can't bring the sacrifices on our own. So how can we appoint a messenger to do something that we ourselves can't do? 1 second. But here is an example of somebody making a messenger to do something that he himself can't do. The slave is appointing a messenger for something that he himself can't do. That the Kohanim must be messengers of God. Because if we appointed them as messengers, is it possible that Anan loymatzin avdinon ve'inu matzi avdi?
23b now, Rabbi.
Yes, we are.
Where?
About 8 lines down from the top of the page. Mi'ikamidi. Mi'ikamidi the Anan loymatzin avdinon, where we cannot appoint a messenger ve'inu matzi avdi, but a messenger could perform the service. In other words, where we ourselves can't do the service, but the messenger could do it on our behalf. We can appoint a messenger. Somewhere says, V'loi is not possible, but here's an example. Over here, we're saying that the slave himself cannot receive an emancipation, but he could appoint a messenger. So clearly we see it is possible for somebody to appoint a messenger, that which he himself can't do. The Gemara says it's incomparable. It's not a fair comparison. Why not? V'lohi. It's not the case. A Jew cannot bring a sacrifice, period. Evid shaykh begittin. A slave, however, could participate in the emancipation of another slave. Why? The time we see Niran hadvorim she'evan mekal begittin shechaverim miad rabbi shechaverim avaloi miad rabbi shalai. In other words, over here, there really is no impediment to a slave serving as either the recipient of his own divorce or a messenger. In other words, there's no inherent problem. What's the problem? It's a technical problem. The technical problem is he just doesn't have the ability to receive a divorce. In other words, the domain, the divorce the emancipation needs to be moved from a domain that the master has control over to a domain the master does not have control over. Since he is his own master slave, the master has control over him. So he doesn't have the ability to receive a divorce. It's a technical problem. However, let's say he's representing a slave of a different master. Is he a domain of the master? No. He's a domain of it. So you have slave A and slave B, right? Owned by master A and master B. So slave B can accept an emancipation. Slave B can accept an emancipation on behalf of slave A from master A. Why? Because over there, you don't have a technical problem. The slave is a domain that master A doesn't control. Slave B is not controlled by master A. Right? Yeah. In other words, over here, the slave really could receive it. There's no inherent problem. There's a problem with us. I believe all of us are Yisraelim. We can't serve in the base of Mikdash, period, full stop. It's not a technical problem. It's a fundamental problem. We're not Kohanim. We can't eat Truma, we can't do the service. However, with a slave, there's no real obstacle to a slave receiving a divorce. It's a technical problem. He's owned by the master. So he is the domain of the master, and a divorce an emancipation needs to be moved past the domain of the master. However, to receive a divorce on behalf of a different slave that belongs to a different master, that would work. And therefore it is incomparable. A slave couldn't appoint a messenger and could receive a divorce on behalf of a slave for a different master. It's not comparable to Kohanim. We together? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, next Gemara is also a fun ride. Whose money? Right, that's the question. That is the question today. Whose money? The money has to be belonging to somebody else. So this is what we already mentioned. According to a mayor, a slave does not own a slave cannot own anything when he's attached to his master. According to the rabbis, he could. And the Gemara will sort of discuss that now. This is a debate. Rameir says that money has to be redeemed through somebody else. The Rameir suffer ein kinyan le'eved b'lo rabbi. Ve'ein kinyan le'isha b'lo bailo. A slave cannot acquire anything without the master, and similarly, a woman from her husband. Rabbanon Savri and the rabbis say, Yesh kinyan le'eved b'lo rabbi, v'yesh kinyan le'isha b'lo bailo. Such a kinyan could exist, both with regard to a slave and with regard to a wife. Rabba says in the name of Sheshis, the Kula Alma Ein Kinyan Le'eved B'lo Rabbi. Everyone agrees that there is no kinyan. That's not subject to debate. Asking, what's the debate here? In other words, everyone agrees that under normal conditions, the woman does not acquire things for herself, and a slave does not acquire things for himself. There's no debate about that. What's the question? Let's say it was given to them on condition that their master or husband does not have control over the money. Rameir says, you're giving it to him, it belongs to the master. The fact that he made conditions, those conditions don't work. They're ineffective. Then the condition actually works, and it goes to the slave or to the woman, and that's how they're able to redeem themselves. Rabbi Lazar says, okay, 1 second. Okay. So this was the opinion of Rabbah in the name of Rav Sheshis. Rabbi Lazar disagrees. Rabbi Lazar has a much tighter definition here. How is it possible for the woman or slave to get money? So Rabbi Lazar says, Rabbi Lazar says, by making a condition is ineffective. Everyone agrees to a mayor that if you make a condition that the master or husband should not have control over the money, it doesn't make a difference. They still get the money. Okay, so how can the slave get money to redeem himself? Somebody gave him $100 to the slave. He says to him, on a condition that this money is used by you for your own emancipation. So it's not giving the money to the slave, it's giving the money to the slave for his emancipation. And that type of kinyan work. Ramirez says it doesn't work. If when you, in other words, the condition is ineffective, the money goes to the master. For Rabban and Savri and the rabbis say the rabbis say he is not the rabbis say that the slave does acquire it, since the slave isn't really acquiring it. It's sort of being acquired in a temporary fashion to redeem himself. In other words, you're giving the money to the slave on condition that he redeems himself with the money. So it's not really even his. It's his in such a limit. In other words, if you give him money on condition that it doesn't go to the master, he can go spend it on Disneyland, right? He's free to do whatever he wants. But over here, there's like almost nothing you can use it for except for emancipating. Therefore,
so we're doing a condition.
So a condition that's a free condition that he can spend the money on Disney, that doesn't work. Okay. A condition where the money must go to his emancipation, that type of condition would work. Yeah. Okay, the explanation is a little bit different, I would say, than that. I would say the explanation is because what's really happening is that effectively it's going to the master, but it's going to the master with the condition that he be emancipated with this money. So that's how we sort of call it the slave's money. Okay. The slave now sort of has a credit account with the master of $100 for redemption. Okay. Now the Gemara has a very interesting question. The Gemara says there's a contradiction between Rameir and the rabbi's opinion. Okay. Before we get into this, the basic idea here is that Rameir is saying that a woman cannot acquire anything without her husband. Anything the woman has, her husband has. And the rabbis disagree with that. Okay. Now, there's a rule on the first, second, fourth, and fifth year of the 7-year Shemitah cycle. There's a tithe called Ma'aser Sheni. Ma'aser Sheni is to be brought to Jerusalem and in Jerusalem. Let's say, obviously, you live far away and you don't have a car, airplane, or whatever it is, and you have to travel, and by the time you get there, the food will probably spoil, or you're not able to go at all. What do? You redeem the Ma'aser onto a coin, and the coin you bring to Jerusalem, you spend the coin on food. Now, when you redeem it on a coin, you need to add 1/5 of the value, 20%. Except if, or conditionally, that you're redeeming your own stuff. So let's say you're redeeming somebody else's Ma'aser Sheni, then you don't redeem with 1/5. And now here's the question. Ein isha paide Ma'aser Sheni b'lo chaimesh. A woman must add 1/5 when she's redeeming Ma'aser Sheni. Reb Shimon ben Elazar Mishum Rameir isha paide Ma'aser Sheni b'lo chaimesh. Rameir says a woman could redeem without 1/5. In other words, presumably, hechidami. What's the scenario? So the husband owns apples, right? Lives in the Golan Heights. He has an apple orchard. It's too far. Golan Heights, Jerusalem is quite a trip. So he's going to redeem his apples onto a coin. Whose coin is it? It's the husband's coin. So what's the woman doing? The woman's sort of acting as his messenger, as his shliach. If that's the case, so then she's effectively it's effectively the husband redeeming his own stuff. His wife is actually saying the words, but it's the husband's fruit, it's the husband's money. She's doing the will of a husband. So therefore, obviously, nobody would disagree that she would have to add a 1/5. The Ella must be the money is her money, and the fruit is his fruit. 1 second. Okay, so the Gemara says Isha Rachmana v'la Isha. Okay, the problem here is that if that's the case, then she is considered acting of her own accord. And if she's acting of her own accord, then she is considered somebody else. And why would anyone think that she would have to add on a chaimish if she's redeeming his own money, with her own money?
How did it confirm?
We'll get there in a second. Well, for right now, it's easy. For right now, the point is she brought it into the marriage.
Okay.
But
Okay.
So but we'll get that question is really the Gemara's key question. How did she get the money? Okay. Elalav, it must be, how did she get the money? So in other words, it can't be that we're talking about the money that she had before marriage, because that then indeed she would be somebody else. And indeed, she would not pay a chaimish. Elalav, it must be that how did she get the money? Somebody gave her money and said, on condition that you use this money to redeem the meiser. And Rameir here is saying that actually the kinyan does work, and therefore she is somebody else and she does not pay a fifth. And the rabbi said the kinyan does not work, the money belongs to her husband, and she does pay a fifth. She does add a fifth. So this is the opposite of our Mishnah. And our Mishnah, Rameir says, Ein kinyan l'isha v'lo ba'al. The woman cannot acquire something that way. And over here, Rameir is saying it does work. And the rabbis who say it does, in our Mishnah, the slave could redeem himself, over here are saying, well, the woman is like the husband because she cannot acquire it in that type of scenario. So Abai says you're right. Epoch, switch around the names. Sort of a cop out. So switch Rameir for the rabbis. Say that according to Rameir, actually she needs to add a chaimish. She needs to add a fifth because the money is not hers. And according to the rabbis, she does not need to add a fifth because the money is hers. So it's sort of a cop out answer. Okay, Rava says no, we don't have to cop out. Don't switch it around. Okay, here is an interesting scenario. What happened was she was a daughter. Obviously, she's somebody's daughter, but she was she was a daughter amongst daughters. So she actually inherited her father.
Oh.
And what did she inherit? She inherited her.
But she can't inherit, can she? Unless all there are no surviving males.
Exactly, correct. I said it's daughter among daughters.
I see. Oh, okay.
Daughter among daughters. So she inherits. It's a very, very good chap. She inherits her father. Her father had the orchard. Her father separated Ma'aser Sheni. So her father has a big palette of thing, spray painted Ma'aser Sheni of apples, right? Ma'aser Sheni apples. Now we have a fundamental question as follows. If you redeem the Ma'aser Sheni, it's considered your. The question really is, how do we look at Ma'aser Sheni? This is a question, debate. Well, I think we'll actually discuss this later on in the Masechta as well. Yeah, we will. Second paragraph actually discuss it. Is Ma'aser, do we say it's Mammon Gavaya or Mammon Hedyot? That means who owns Ma'aser? And the same thing is true really of Kachim as well. So you're a Kain, get a sacrifice. Can you give that as Kiddushin to a woman? Let's say she's a Kain also, so she can eat it too. Can you give her does it even belong to you? Or you eat it? God said Kahanim are allowed to eat it. Doesn't mean you actually own it. They call it Mishulchan Gavaya Kazachal. It's from God's table. You don't actually own Ma'aser Sheni. God has allowed you to eat Ma'aser Sheni. But it doesn't mean that you own it. It's sort of sanctified and it's owned by God, so to speak. And you don't actually own it. And that's the question here. So now, does the woman actually own her own Ma'aser Sheni? Rameir says Ma'aser belongs to Hektish. And the husband does not acquire it. And therefore, we're talking about redeeming here with the husband's money. But the husband is redeeming on somebody else's Ma'aser. And that Ma'aser doesn't belong to him because Ma'aser doesn't belong to you. Your own Ma'aser is considered to belong to you. But once you move it to somebody else's domain, we say it's Mishulchan Gavaya Kazach. It's sort of God's money. So the husband never acquired the Ma'aser Sheni. It doesn't belong to him. It still belongs to the deceased father-in-law, right? The husband's deceased father-in-law, the woman's father, and he never acquires it, and therefore his money on somebody else's Ma'aser, no reason for a chaimish. The rabbis say that actually he does inherit it because it is inheritable, it is transferable. You actually own it, and therefore the husband acquires the Ma'aser Sheni, And because he acquires a Meiser Sheni, that he redeems it himself. Therefore, the woman is doing his work with his money, and therefore she must add a Chaimesh, a fifth. Okay. Yeah. 6 minutes. Let's start the next Gemara. We'll finish it. If not, we'll stop middle. That's fine. Okay. So now next Gemara. So all sorts of different rules. One of the rules here is Yotze b'shein v'ayin. Tana Yotze b'shein v'ayin v'rosh yivarim she'ein chayzer. So here's what you need. If you're a Evet Kanani, the guy knocks out a tooth or he knocks out an eye. He doesn't actually have to knock out an eye. He blinds an eye. How do you define blinding? We'll get to that tomorrow. V'rosh yivarim, or the ends, the tips of any organ, and these are she'ein and chayzer that they'll never grow back. It's permanent damage. So b'shlem she'ein v'ayin ksifi. Shein v'ayin, the Torah gives it as examples of things that if you knock out his tooth or blind him, then he leaves the servitude. But how do you know that any organ that gets knocked out or permanently damaged is grounds for an Evet Kanani to leave? So Gemara says, "Dumi de shein v'ayin," similar to an eye and a tooth. And just like these are exposed, right? They're not internal damage. They will never return. So too, any type of exposed permanent damage that will never grow back, never heal, is worthy of sending a slave. Okay. So Gemara asks her, what the typical rule is that the Torah gives two exceptions to something, then we say it's shnei ksuma b'amka achad ve'ein melamdin. Meaning we say that if the Torah gives two exclusions or limits a law to two things, then that means the law is limited to just two and nothing else. Great if I had an offhand example to give you, but unfortunately I can't think of one offhand. I think good but here the Torah gives two specific tooth, nothing else. So the Gemara says, no, you can't do that. Why not? Because tzricha, it is necessary for the Torah to indicate both types of wounds. Why? Because if the Torah would have only written a tooth, I would think afilu shein d'cholov, even a baby tooth. A baby tooth will grow back as an adult tooth. So therefore, it has to be an eye. An eye is permanent. There's no baby eye. I would think that he's born with his eye, but a tooth that grows in later is not he actually would not leave if his tooth was knocked out, because his tooth is not an organ that he was born with. So therefore, it's necessary for the Torah to write both, and because it's necessary to write both types of wounds, of permanent damages, therefore we could learn other types of damages, other organs that are lost from this category. We'll stop here. Okay.